You can
Oh my
keep it
God,
or
is this
return it.
real?
Either
It's all
way,
yours.
you're already
I'm
in
sure.
this.
I can't accept this.
Those
You
words
can.
wouldn't make sense to Deborah McKnight until it was far too late, but on this freezing Tuesday night at Valentino's Steakhouse, the man who'd spoken them was already walking out the door. Before we start, make sure to hit like and subscribe, and really, I'm curious. Where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The opulent dining room of Valentino's Steakhouse pulsed with the kind of wealth that made ordinary people feel like trespassers. Crystal chandeliers threw fractured light across tables where Chicago's elite conducted business in hushed tones, where handshakes meant more than contracts, and where the wrong glance could end a career. Deborah McKnight moved between the tables like a ghost, present, efficient, invisible. Her red and white uniform was crisp despite the 11-hour shift grinding her bones to dust. Her sensible shoes, worn thin at the heels, whispered against marble floors as she balanced trays that cost more than her monthly rent. Tuesday night. Her third double this week. And somewhere in a cramped Pilsen apartment, her 7-year-old daughter Maya was falling asleep without a goodnight kiss because medical bills didn't pay themselves. At 32, Deborah had mastered the art of being everywhere and nowhere. Her dark hair scraped back into a bun so tight it made her temples ache. Her professional smile, the one she practiced in the mirror until it looked genuine, hid the exhaustion carving lines around her eyes. Her hands moved with practiced precision, never trembling even when her back screamed and her feet throbbed. She couldn't afford mistakes. Not when Maya's prescription costs had doubled. Not when the landlord was making noises about rent increases. Not when every shift felt like swimming through concrete just to stay afloat. Table 7 didn't need to announce itself. It commanded. Enzo Russo sat in the corner booth like a king surveying a kingdom he'd built on bones and silence. At 45, he wore his tailored Italian suit like armor, midnight black, perfectly cut, expensive enough to feed a family for 6 months. His dark eyes swept the room with the lazy confidence of a predator that had never known fear, tracking movement, calculating threats, assessing value in the time it took most people to blink. 2 men flanked him. Silent. Watchful. Their bulky frames barely contained by matching dark suits, their eyes scanning exits and entrances with military precision. The kind of men who didn't ask questions, only executed answers. The entire restaurant felt it. Conversations dropped to whispers when Enzo shifted in his seat. Servers suddenly remembered tasks in the kitchen. Even the sommelier took the long way around to reach the bar. Deborah drew the short straw. Frank, the floor manager, had actually made them draw straws, 5 waitresses huddled by the espresso machine like soldiers picking who'd walk point. Deborah pulled the short one. Of course she did. Her luck had been running on fumes for years. She approached table 7 with her order pad and her customer service smile, took his order for a single espresso, and returned 3 minutes later with the small white cup balanced on a silver tray. Enzo barely glanced at her. His fingers, adorned with a single platinum ring, signed the check with a flourish that spoke of endless practice. He stood, his bodyguards materializing at his sides like shadows gaining substance, and walked toward the exit without a backward glance. Deborah cleared the table on autopilot, plate, napkin, signed check, and then her hands froze. There, sitting in the center of the white tablecloth like a landmine disguised as jewelry, was a watch that looked like it belonged in a vault, not a restaurant. The Richard Mille RM11-03. Even in the chandelier's golden glow, it was unmistakable. The skeleton dial exposed its intricate mechanical heart, hundreds of tiny components working in perfect synchronization. The titanium case caught light and bent it into something that looked almost illegal. This wasn't a watch. This was a small fortune wearing the shape of time. "Sir. Sir, you forgot." Deborah's voice cut across the dining room, turning heads, breaking the careful silence. But Enzo Russo was already gone, disappeared through the heavy oak doors like smoke, his guards flanking him into the frozen Chicago night. Frank materialized at her elbow so fast she jumped. His face had gone the color of old newspaper, all the blood drained south. His hands shook as he gripped her forearm. "Deborah." His voice was barely a whisper, urgent and terrified. "That's Enzo Russo. You don't chase Enzo Russo. You don't call after him. You don't question him." His eyes darted to the watch, and his grip tightened. And if he left that watch, he meant to leave it. Don't ask questions. Don't try to understand. Just take it, cash out your tips, and go home. Right now. Disappear for a while. The weight in Frank's voice was the kind that came from knowing things, bad things, the kind that kept you awake at night. But Deborah McKnight had never been good at running from things that didn't make sense. The watch sat heavy in her apron pocket as she finished her shift, its weight somehow greater than its size. By the time she walked out into the February cold, her phone's browser was already glowing with search results that made her stomach drop. $1.2 million. Richard Mille RM11-03. One of the rarest timepieces in the world. And it was hers. Except it wasn't. Couldn't be. Men like Enzo Russo didn't make million-dollar mistakes. Which meant this was something else entirely. The watch sat on Deborah's kitchen table like an accusation, its titanium case catching the weak light from the overhead fixture and throwing it back in fractured pieces. In the next room, Maya slept curled around her threadbare stuffed rabbit, her breathing soft and steady, blissfully unaware that their entire future might have just changed. Or ended. Deborah turned the timepiece over in her hands, marveling at its weight, its precision, its sheer impossibility. The mechanism visible through the skeleton dial moved with the kind of perfection that only obscene amounts of money could buy. She could sell it. The thought hit her like a physical thing, solid and tempting. Pay off the medical bills stacked on the counter like accusations. Get Maya the surgery the specialists kept saying she needed. Move out of this cramped Pilsen apartment with its leaking ceiling that left brown water stains shaped like continents and windows so drafty she stuffed towels in the frames every winter. Start over somewhere safe, somewhere clean, somewhere that didn't smell like mildew and broken dreams. Her phone's browser glowed in the darkness as she searched with trembling fingers, Richard Mille RM11-03. The results made her stomach drop through the floor. $1.2 million. $1.2 million. For a watch. She refreshed the page, certain it was a mistake, certain the internet had hiccuped and added an extra zero. The number didn't change. Neither did the descriptions: ultra-rare, investment-grade timepiece, worn by royalty and billionaires. Why would a man like Enzo Russo leave $1 million watch for a waitress he'd barely looked at? The question gnawed at her like something with teeth. Men like him didn't make mistakes. They didn't forget things worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. Every action was calculated, deliberate, purposeful. Which meant this was intentional. But intentional how? And why her? Under her desk lamp's harsh light, Deborah noticed something unusual, A tiny seam in the crown mechanism, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, unless the light hit it just right. Her fingers traced it, feeling the microscopic gap. She sat back, her mind racing. 20 minutes later, she was knocking on apartment 3C. Tyler opened the door in sweatpants and a faded UIC hoodie, his hair sticking up in directions that defied physics. He was a computer science student who lived on ramen and energy drinks, and who owed Deborah favors for the free dinners she'd smuggled him from Valentino's over the past 6 months. "Deb?" "It's almost midnight." He stopped when he saw her face. "What's wrong?" "I need your help with something." "Tech stuff." 10 minutes later, Tyler sat at her kitchen table with the watch, his laptop open, a jeweler's loupe he'd borrowed from his roommate pressed to his eye. He examined it with the intensity of someone solving a puzzle that might actually matter. His fingers moved over the crown, pressing, twisting, testing. Then he froze. Oh shit. What? There's a USB interface built into the crown mechanism. Whoever made this watch modified it. His fingers flew across his keyboard, connecting cables, running programs that filled his screen with code that looked like alien language. "Give me a second. This encryption is military grade. But whoever locked it used a default password scheme. Amateurs." He typed furiously for another 3 minutes, his face illuminated by the screen's glow. Then his eyes went wide behind his glasses. "Holy shit. Tyler, you're scaring me. Deborah, this isn't just a watch. It's a data vault." He turned the laptop toward her. The screen showed folders within folders, files with names that made her blood run cold. Encrypted files. Financial records. Offshore accounts. Surveillance footage. He clicked through them, his face growing paler with each revelation. Names, dates, transactions that painted a picture of an empire built on violence and corruption. Money laundering through Chicago's most prestigious businesses, restaurants, construction companies, real estate developments. Bribes to federal judges, aldermen, police captains. Photos of men in expensive suits shaking hands with men whose faces she recognized from news reports about organized crime. Evidence that could topple an entire criminal organization. The watch wasn't a tip. It was insurance. Or a trap. And Deborah McKnight was now holding evidence that men killed to protect. In the next room, Maya stirred in her sleep, murmuring something soft about butterflies and sunshine, about the park and ice cream and tomorrow. Deborah looked from her daughter's closed door to the watch sitting on her kitchen table like a live grenade, her decision crystallizing like ice in her chest. "You're insane," Tyler said for the 3rd time, pacing her cramped kitchen like a caged animal. "You're absolutely, completely insane. Do you understand what you're holding? Do you know who Enzo Russo is?" Deborah understood perfectly. Enzo Russo was the man who controlled half of Chicago's underground economy. The man whose name made hardened criminals look over their shoulders in bars and alleys. The man who could make people disappear with a phone call, their absence explained away by convenient accidents and sudden relocations that nobody questioned. And she was going to walk up to him and return his property. "Because it's not mine," she said simply, her voice steadier than her hands. Tyler stared at her like she'd announced plans to swim to the moon. "Not yours?" "Deborah, he left it for you. That makes it yours. Finders keepers. Basic property law. You could disappear tonight, start over somewhere warm, give Maya the life she deserves." He stopped when he saw her expression. You've already decided, haven't you? I have. Wednesday evening arrived too quickly and not quickly enough. Deborah dressed in her uniform with trembling hands, her fingers fumbling the buttons twice before getting them right. The watch sat in her apron pocket, heavier than physics should allow. Maya was at her mother's apartment in Bridgeport, safe, unaware, probably watching cartoons and eating the sugary cereal Deborah's mother kept buying despite being told not to. That was fine. Better than fine. Maya needed to be far away from whatever happened next. Frank was waiting at Valentino's entrance, his face already resigned to failure before she even reached the door. Deborah, whatever you're thinking, don't. Please. Just don't. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too many people make fatal mistakes. You walk in there with that watch, you're either the bravest person I've ever met or the dumbest. Either way, I can't protect you. She walked past him anyway, pushing through the heavy oak doors into the golden light and hushed conversations. The dining room fell silent as she crossed the floor, a silence so complete she could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Enzo sat in the same booth, same time, same security detail flanking him like bookends made of muscle and violence. But this time, when she approached, every eye in the restaurant followed her. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to mouths. The entire room held its breath. One of the bodyguards stood, his hand moving toward his jacket with practiced efficiency, but Enzo raised one finger, a small gesture, barely more than a twitch, that froze the man mid-motion like someone had hit a pause button on his existence. Deborah stopped at the edge of the table. Her hand steadied as she reached into her apron pocket and placed the watch on the white tablecloth between them, the titanium case catching the chandelier light and throwing it back in sharp, accusatory angles. You forgot this last night, Mr. Russo. For the first time, Enzo truly looked at her. Not through her, not past her, but at her. His dark eyes assessed her like a ledger that didn't balance, like an equation with variables that refused to resolve, searching for the angle, the con, the hidden agenda that had to be there because nobody did what she was doing. His crew exchanged confused glances, their expressions ranging from bewilderment to something that looked almost like respect. Returning something to Enzo Russo? Nobody did that. Nobody was that stupid, or that honest. You know what this is worth? Enzo asked quietly, his voice carrying despite its softness, filling the silence like water filling a glass. I do. And you know who I am? I do. Then why? The question hung in the air like smoke, curling and expanding, demanding an answer that made sense in a world where nothing made sense anymore. Deborah met his gaze without flinching, channeling every ounce of courage she possessed, every moment she'd faced down bill collectors and landlords and doctors with their sympathetic expressions and expensive solutions. Because it's not mine. And because my daughter is watching how I live my life. I won't teach her that we take what doesn't belong to us, no matter how desperate we are. The restaurant held its breath. Somewhere in the kitchen, a pot clattered against metal, the sound absurdly loud in the pressing silence. Enzo's expression remained unreadable, his face a mask carved from marble, but something flickered behind his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or recognition of something he'd thought long extinct, something he'd stopped believing existed outside of fairy tales and childhood memories. The moment stretched like taffy, pulling thin and translucent, threatening to snap. Then Enzo gestured to the seat across from him, a simple motion that carried the weight of a royal decree. Sit, he said finally. We need to talk. 4 tables away, Special Agent Sarah Chen lowered her wine glass and fought to keep her expression neutral, her training screaming at her to remain invisible, unremarkable, just another professional enjoying an overpriced dinner. 3 years. 3 years she'd been hunting Enzo Russo, building cases that collapsed when witnesses recanted or disappeared, chasing warrants that dead-ended in legal technicalities, running wiretaps that somehow always knew when to go silent. And a waitress just walked up and handed him evidence that the FBI had been trying to obtain through every legal channel and a few that weren't. Chen's hand trembled slightly as she set down her glass. This changed everything. The morning came too early and brought federal agents with it. 2 sharp knocks at 6:47 a.m., precise and authoritative, the kind of knocking that said we're coming in whether you open this door or not. Deborah stumbled to the door in sweatpants and an old t-shirt, her eyes still blurry with sleep, and froze when she saw the badges reflecting the hallway's harsh fluorescent lights. Agent Sarah Chen and Agent Tom Reynolds stood in her doorway with expressions that made Deborah's blood run cold. Chen's carefully neutral, Reynolds's predatory in a way that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with power. "Ms. McKnight, we need to talk about the watch." They sat in her cramped living room, their presence making the small space feel even smaller, their suits too crisp and expensive for the worn furniture and water-stained walls. Chen took the armchair, Reynolds the couch, positioning themselves with the casual precision of people who'd done this 1,000 times before. Deborah perched on the edge of the kitchen chair she dragged in, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had gone cold while she wasn't paying attention. Chen did most of the talking, her voice professional but not unkind, the tone of someone delivering bad news they wished they didn't have to deliver. By accessing those files, you became a material witness in a federal racketeering investigation. We need your cooperation. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes searching Deborah's face. We know you had help opening the watch. We know what you saw. And we know you returned it to Enzo Russo last night. Deborah's stomach dropped. They'd been watching. Of course they'd been watching. I didn't mean to. Intent doesn't matter, Reynolds interrupted, his tone harder than Chen's, sharp enough to cut. You saw classified evidence in an ongoing investigation. That makes you involved. That makes you complicit if you don't help us. He settled back into the couch like he owned it, his smile cold and calculating. Chen shot Reynolds a look that could have frozen water, then turned back to Deborah with something that almost resembled sympathy. We understand this is difficult, Ms. McKnight. But Enzo Russo is a dangerous man. What you saw on that watch could help us take down his entire organization, money laundering, extortion, murder. We need you to testify about what you found. What was on those files? How he reacted when you returned it. The walls seemed to close in, the ceiling pressing down like the lid of a coffin. Testify. Against a man who made people disappear. Against a man whose name made hardened criminals look over their shoulders. While raising a 7-year-old daughter alone in a city where Enzo Russo owned half the streets and most of the people walking on them. What if I refuse? Deborah asked quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper. Reynolds leaned forward, his smile not reaching his eyes, not even trying to. Then we'll have to question how a single mother working as a waitress suddenly has access to evidence in a federal case. We'll have to investigate whether you're involved in Russo's organization. Whether you're being paid to keep quiet. He paused, letting the implications settle like poison in still water. Child Services might have concerns about the environment you're providing for your daughter. The kind of people you're associating with. Whether Maya is safe in your care. The threat landed like a physical blow, driving the air from Deborah's lungs. Maya. They were threatening Maya. Using her daughter as leverage, as a weapon, as insurance for cooperation they couldn't legally compel. Chen handed her a card, her expression unreadable but her eyes carrying something that might have been an apology. "Think about it, Ms. McKnight. We'll be in touch." She stood, smoothing her jacket with practiced efficiency. "We're not the enemy here. Enzo Russo is. We're trying to help you." As they left, Deborah noticed Reynolds pause at the door, his hand on the frame, his expression calculating in a way that made her skin crawl. He looked back at her with eyes that assessed value the way a butcher assessed meat, then smiled, a thin, mirthless thing that never touched his eyes, and followed Chen into the hallway. The door closed with a soft click that sounded like a cell locking. Deborah sat in the silence of her apartment, the morning light filtering through cheap curtains, her daughter still asleep in the next room, blissfully unaware. She was trapped between the mob and the FBI, and somewhere in that narrowing space between monsters, she had to find a way to protect Maya. The text came from an unknown number at 11:34 p.m., rooftop. "Midnight. Come alone." Deborah knew she should ignore it. Should call the FBI, call Chen, call someone with a badge and a gun and the authority to protect her. Should do anything except what she was about to do. She went anyway. The rooftop of an abandoned warehouse in the West Loop offered a panoramic view of Chicago's skyline, its lights glittering like false promises against the black expanse of Lake Michigan. The wind cut through her jacket with February teeth, carrying the smell of old concrete and rust. Enzo stood near the edge, his back to her, flanked by his two ever-present shadows who materialized from the darkness like conjured things. "You came," he said without turning, his voice carrying over the wind. "I wasn't sure you would." Deborah's voice was steadier than she felt, steadier than her hands shoved deep in her pockets to hide their trembling. "The FBI came to my apartment this morning. They want me to testify against you. They threaten to take my daughter if I don't cooperate." She expected anger, violence, the legendary Russo fury that Chicago whispered about in bars and back alleys. Expected guns, threats, the kind of response that made people disappear into the Chicago River wrapped in chains. Instead, Enzo turned to face her, his expression thoughtful, almost curious. "Which agents?" "Sarah Chen and Tom Reynolds." Something dark crossed Enzo's face at the second name, a flicker of rage so pure it made the temperature seem to drop another 10 degrees. His jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists before deliberately relaxing. "Reynolds. Reynolds has been on my payroll for 6 years, Enzo said quietly, as if discussing the weather or the price of coffee. He feeds us information, raids, warrants, witnesses who've agreed to cooperate. We pay him very well, and everyone pretends the system works. The criminals get caught just often enough to make it look legitimate, the FBI gets their conviction rate, and Reynolds gets richer." He turned back to the skyline, his profile sharp against the city lights. "But threatening a civilian, especially you." He trailed off, his jaw tightening again. "That's not sanctioned. That's Reynolds working an angle of his own. Why did you leave me the watch?" The question she'd been carrying since that first night finally escaped, spilling out into the cold air between them. "Why me?" Enzo was silent for a long moment, the city's ambient noise filling the space, distant sirens, the rumble of the L train, the eternal hum of traffic. When he finally spoke, his voice carried something that might have been sadness. I wanted to see if there was still one honest person left in this godforsaken city. One person who would do the right thing even when it cost them everything. He turned to face her fully, stepping away from the edge, his guards shifting but not interfering. You returned something worth $1 million when you had every reason to keep it. When your daughter needs surgery you can't afford. When you're working yourself to death just to stay in an apartment with a leaking ceiling. That kind of integrity doesn't exist in my world. Maybe that's why I needed to find it in someone else's. The words hung between them, honest in a way that felt dangerous, vulnerable in a way that seemed impossible for a man like Enzo Russo. I've been trying to get out for years, Enzo continued, his voice dropping lower, almost confessional. Trying to find a way to walk away from all of this. But corrupt feds like Reynolds and rival families keep pulling me back in. Every time I try to leave, someone has leverage, someone has dirt, someone has a reason to keep me exactly where I am. He gestured to the watch that was no longer there, the evidence now back in his possession. That watch was meant to be my exit strategy, evidence I could trade for immunity, for protection, for a chance to disappear and start over. But I didn't trust anyone to hold it. Not my lawyers, not my crew, not even family. He paused, his eyes meeting hers. Until now. Help me expose Reynolds and his crew, and I'll help you protect Maya, Enzo said, extending his hand, not a handshake, but an offering, a partnership between impossible allies. We both want the same thing, truth to win for once. Justice that isn't bought or traded or corrupted. One honest outcome in a city built on lies. Deborah looked at the offered hand of a mobster, a killer, a man who'd built an empire on violence and fear, and realized it might be the only honest thing in Chicago. She reached out and took it. The FBI wire was smaller than Deborah imagined, a tiny piece of technology taped to her sternum that felt like a bomb waiting to explode. Agent Chen had installed it herself in the back of an unmarked van 3 blocks from Deborah's apartment, her hands gentle but professional, her eyes carrying an apology she couldn't voice. Reynolds doesn't know about this operation, Chen had whispered, her breath warm against Deborah's ear as she adjusted the microphone. As far as he knows, you agreed to cooperate with him specifically. You're helping me catch a dirty agent. That's all you need to know. That's all you can know. The abandoned warehouse Reynolds chose for the meeting smelled of rust and old secrets, of machinery that had stopped running decades ago and dreams that had died with it. Deborah arrived 20 minutes early, her heart hammering so hard she worried the wire would pick up nothing but its thunder, that Chen and her team listening somewhere in the darkness would hear only the sound of her terror. Enzo had coached her over burner phones and encrypted messages, stay calm. Let him do the talking. Dirty cops love to brag. They can't help themselves. Give him rope and he'll hang himself with it. Reynolds arrived exactly on time, walking in with 3 other men, 2 she didn't recognize and 1 she did, a federal agent she'd seen on the news accepting commendations for breaking up a drug ring. They all carried themselves with the false authority of those who believed they were untouchable, who'd operated in shadows so long they'd forgotten what light looked like. Ms. McKnight. Glad you could make it. Reynolds's smile was the kind that made her skin crawl, predatory and cold. Have you thought about our conversation? Deborah forced herself to nod, channeling every ounce of acting ability she developed serving rude customers and hiding exhaustion behind professional smiles. I'll testify. I just need protection for my daughter. You promised protection. Reynolds smiled wider, pulling out a silver flask from his jacket pocket. Smart woman. See, this is how the real world works. You play ball, everyone wins. You get protection, your daughter stays safe, we get Russo, and I get a promotion. He took a drink, the liquid amber in the dim warehouse light. You fight the system. He gestured vaguely with the flask. Well, the system always wins. It always does. One of his companions laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Like that teacher in Evanston who tried to report us. Where's she now? Rehab facility downstate, another answered, checking his phone like they were discussing sports scores. Funny how her drug problems suddenly got so much worse after she started asking questions. Tragic, really. As Reynolds detailed years of corruption, planted evidence in lockers of suspects who wouldn't pay, falsified reports that sent innocent people to prison, paid off witnesses who testified to crimes they'd never seen, entire cases built on foundations of lies, Deborah noticed movement in the shadows. Shapes materializing from darkness, silent and professional, positioning themselves with military precision. Agent Chen emerged with a full tactical team, weapons drawn, federal warrants in hand, her voice cutting through the warehouse like a blade. FBI. Nobody move. Hands where we can see them. Reynolds's face went white, then red with rage, the color rising from his collar like a thermometer measuring fury. His hand moved toward his weapon with the instinct of someone who'd never been caught, never been challenged, never believed this moment could arrive. Time seemed to slow. Deborah stood frozen in the center of a potential firefight, exactly where Enzo said she might end up, exactly where she'd promised herself she'd never be. Laser sights painted red dots across Reynolds's chest, his companions' chests, creating a constellation of potential death. Don't, Enzo's voice echoed from the warehouse entrance as he stepped into view, hands raised, his two bodyguards flanking him with their own hands visible and empty. She's not part of this game. She was never part of this. You want someone to shoot at? I'm right here. Reynolds's gun was halfway out of his holster when Chen's team tackled him, the crash of bodies against concrete echoing like thunder, like the end of something that had been rotting for years finally collapsing under its own weight. She's the only honest person in this room. Enzo's voice carried across the warehouse as federal agents swarmed like ants on spilled sugar, weapons trained on everyone who moved, red laser sights painting dots across chests and foreheads. And I won't let her pay for my sins or yours. Agent Chen approached Enzo carefully, her weapon lowered but ready, her finger resting alongside the trigger guard with the discipline of someone who'd been trained never to point at anything she didn't intend to destroy. Enzo Russo, you have the right to remain silent. I waive those rights, Enzo interrupted, his voice calm, almost serene, the voice of someone who'd been waiting for this moment and had finally stopped running from it. I want to make a deal. Full cooperation against the corruption network Reynolds runs. Names, dates, transactions, bank accounts, everything on that watch and everything I know that isn't. He gestured to Deborah, who stood trembling in the center of the warehouse, the wire still taped to her chest. In exchange, she and her daughter get full immunity and witness protection. New identities, relocation assistance, the full package. Non-negotiable. Handcuffed against a support beam 20 feet away, Reynolds spat blood and venom, his lip split from where an agent's elbow had connected during the takedown. You think you're a hero, Russo? You're a criminal. A murderer. You've killed people, destroyed families, poisoned this city for decades. She'll see that eventually. She'll see what you really are. Enzo's expression didn't change, didn't flicker with rage or defensiveness or anything except a terrible, honest acceptance. I know exactly what I am. But I also know what you are, a corrupt federal agent who sold his oath for money, who destroyed innocent lives to protect guilty ones, who wore a badge while doing everything it's supposed to stand against. At least I never pretended to be anything else. At least I never hid behind the law while pissing on it. Chen nodded to her team, her voice carrying the weight of authority and something that sounded almost like satisfaction. Agent Thomas Reynolds, you're under arrest for corruption, racketeering, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and violation of civil rights under color of law. She turned to the three men who'd arrived with him, now face down on the concrete with agents kneeling on their backs. Officers Morrison, Jackson, and Valdez, you're also under arrest on the same charges. The warehouse filled with the mechanical clicking of handcuffs, the reading of rights delivered in monotone voices that had recited the same words 1,000 times, the collapse of a network that had operated in shadows for years finally dragged into harsh fluorescent light. Reynolds screamed threats that echoed off rusted metal and broken windows, promises of lawyers and connections and consequences, the desperate noise of power realizing it had already slipped away. Chen turned to Deborah, her expression softening in a way that made her look younger, more human, less like the federal agent and more like someone who'd just won a battle she'd been fighting for years. You did the right thing, Ms. McKnight. We'll have a protection detail on you and Maya within the hour. New identities if you want them, relocation assistance, witness protection, the full package. You and your daughter are safe now. Deborah looked at Enzo, who was being cuffed with surprising gentleness by federal agents who seemed to recognize the difference between an arrest and a surrender, who understood that the man standing before them was choosing this, was walking into a cage with his eyes open and his head high. Thank you, Deborah said quietly, her voice barely carrying over the commotion of arrests and radio chatter. Enzo met her eyes, and for just a moment, the warehouse and the agents and the chaos fell away, leaving just two people who'd found something rare and precious in the ugliest of circumstances. No. Thank you. You reminded me that some things can't be bought or stolen. They have to be earned. As agents led him toward the waiting vehicles, their hands on his arms more escort than force, he called back over his shoulder, his voice carrying across the distance. Tell Maya that even scary men can try to do the right thing. And for the first time in years, maybe the first time ever, Deborah saw something in Enzo Russo's eyes that looked almost like peace. 6 months later, the federal courthouse in downtown Chicago buzzed with reporters, protesters, and the curious public wanting to witness the trial of the century. News vans lined the street outside, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like mechanical flowers seeking sun. The United States versus Enzo Russo and Thomas Reynolds had captivated the nation, a mob boss and a corrupt federal agent, their fates intertwined in a case that exposed rot at every level of law enforcement, that peeled back the city's skin to reveal the infection festering beneath. Deborah sat in the witness box, her hand on the Bible, facing a courtroom packed with people who would decide multiple fates. She dressed carefully that morning, a simple navy dress, modest heels, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. Maya was with her mother in Bridgeport, safe, watching cartoons, unaware that her mother was about to testify in the most publicized trial Chicago had seen in decades. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Angela Morrison with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, approached the witness stand with the confidence of someone holding all the cards. Ms. McKnight, please describe the night of February 4th, when you first encountered the watch. As Deborah spoke, describing Valentino's golden chandeliers, Enzo's corner booth, the Richard Mille sitting on white linen like evidence of impossible choices, she could feel Enzo's eyes on her from the defendant's table. Not threatening, not angry, but somehow grateful, as if her words were confirming something he'd always suspected about himself but had never been able to articulate. Morrison presented the watch itself, now sealed in clear evidence plastic and marked as Exhibit A, its crystal face containing the digital destruction of a criminal empire. She held it up for the jury to see, turning it slowly so the light caught the intricate mechanisms visible through the skeleton dial. Ms. McKnight discovered encrypted files detailing years of money laundering, racketeering, and murder. Bank accounts in the Cayman Islands. Payoffs to judges and aldermen. Surveillance footage of criminal meetings. She paused for effect. But she also discovered something else, evidence that FBI agent Thomas Reynolds was being paid to protect Mr. Russo's operations. That the very man tasked with bringing down organized crime was instead feeding it information and protection. The courtroom erupted in whispers, a wave of sound that crashed against the judge's gavel until order was restored. Enzo's lawyer, a distinguished man named Robert Kane with silver hair and a reputation for defending the indefensible, surprised everyone by not attacking Deborah's credibility. He didn't question her motives or suggest she was lying or paint her as an accomplice. Instead, he approached the witness stand with a kind of gentle respect and asked simple questions in a voice that carried to every corner of the packed courtroom. "Did Mr. Russo threaten you, Ms. McKnight?" "No." "Did he attempt to intimidate you into keeping the watch?" "No." "He was surprised I returned it." "And when you came to him about Agent Reynolds' threats against your daughter, what did he do?" Deborah met Enzo's eyes across the courtroom, seeing the man who'd stood on a warehouse rooftop and offered her an alliance when she had nothing, who'd protected Maya when he could have just as easily made them both disappear. "He protected my daughter. And he turned himself in to expose the corruption." The judge, a stern black woman named Judith Harper whose face belonged on currency for all the emotion it showed, reviewed the plea agreement with careful scrutiny, reading each page with the attention of someone who understood that justice was often found in the details others overlooked. "Mr. Russo, you're pleading guilty to racketeering and conspiracy. In exchange for your cooperation against the federal corruption network, cooperation which has already resulted in 17 additional arrests and the overturning of 43 wrongful convictions, the government recommends 8 years with parole eligibility in 5. Do you understand the terms of this agreement?" "Yes, Your Honor." Enzo's voice was steady, clear, no hesitation. "And you're doing this voluntarily? No one has coerced you or promised you anything beyond what's written in this agreement?" Enzo glanced at Deborah one more time, his expression carrying something that looked almost like gratitude, like peace, like a man who'd finally found the exit he'd been searching for. "I am." Reynolds, convicted on all counts after refusing any deal, after screaming his innocence through a trial that buried him in evidence, received 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. As marshals led him away in chains, he screamed threats that echoed off marble walls and vaulted ceilings, promises of revenge, connections that would set him free, lawyers who would overturn everything. The last desperate gasps of power he no longer possessed, of authority that had already crumbled to dust. As guards prepared to take Enzo away, he turned to Deborah one final time. The courtroom noise faded, the reporters and cameras and curious public becoming background static. "Thank you for showing me there's still something worth saving," he said quietly, his words meant only for her. 3 years later, autumn leaves scattered across a Chicago street that had seen too much violence and not enough hope, their colors, amber and crimson and gold, painting the sidewalks with temporary beauty. Deborah McKnight, now working as a regional advocate for the Innocence Project, walked Maya home from school, listening to her daughter chatter about science class and soccer practice, about the goal she'd almost scored in the experiment with vinegar and baking soda that had erupted all over Mr. Henderson's desk. The little girl was healthy now, the surgery successful, her lungs clear and strong, her future bright in a way that had once seemed impossible. That evening, a knock at the door made Deborah pause mid-stir of the pasta sauce simmering on the stove. Through the peephole, she saw a man who looked familiar yet transformed, thinner, grayer at the temples, his face carrying lines that hadn't been there before, but with eyes that carried clarity instead of shadows, peace instead of calculation. She opened the door. Enzo. He stood on her doorstep holding a small box wrapped in plain brown paper, wearing civilian clothes, jeans, a simple button-down shirt, a jacket that looked like it came from a department store rather than an Italian tailor. The ordinariness of it seemed almost miraculous, like seeing a wolf dressed in sheep's clothing except in reverse, predator transformed into something approaching normal. Early release for exemplary cooperation, he explained, his voice rough with emotion he didn't try to hide. 3 years instead of 8. I wanted to thank you properly. He held out the box. This is for you. For Maya. Inside the box was a key, silver and ordinary, attached to a keychain stamped with an address in Pilsen. What is this? Deborah asked. Enzo's smile was genuine, reaching his eyes in a way she'd never seen during those nights at Valentino's, transforming his face into something that looked almost young. A community center in Pilsen. 3 floors. Legal aid on the first floor, job training and GED classes on the second, after-school programs and a safe space for kids on the third. Everything I should have built instead of what I did build. He looked past her to where Maya peeked around the corner, her dark eyes wide and curious. It's named after your daughter. The Maya McKnight Center for Second Chances. Deborah's hand closed around the key, her throat tight with emotions she couldn't name. Enzo, I can't. You didn't just return a watch, Enzo continued, his words tumbling out like he'd been holding them for 3 years and could finally release them. You returned my humanity. For 3 years, I've worked with the FBI, dismantling networks, freeing wrongfully convicted people, testifying against everyone I once called allies. Trying to undo decades of damage. His voice dropped lower. 17 wrongful convictions overturned because of evidence I provided. 17 people who got their lives back. It doesn't erase what I did, the people I hurt, the lives I destroyed, but maybe. He trailed off, looking at the key in her hand. Maybe it's a start. Deborah invited him in, not as Enzo Russo, the mob boss, the man who'd commanded fear with a gesture, but as a man who'd learned that real power isn't taken, it's earned through integrity, through choosing to be better even when being worse would be easier. They sat at her small kitchen table with coffee, talking about transformation, redemption, and the long road of making amends that never really ended but sometimes led somewhere worth going. Mom, Maya asked quietly from the doorway, her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm, is this the scary man who helped us? Enzo knelt down to her level, his movements careful, unthreatening, his face open in a way that would have been impossible 3 years ago. I was scary. Your mom is right about that. I did bad things for a long time. He paused, choosing his words with care. But your mom showed me how to be better. Sometimes even grown-ups need help learning to do the right thing. Sometimes we make mistakes for years and years before someone shows us there's another way. Maya considered this with the seriousness of a 10-year-old philosopher. Are you still scary? I'm trying very hard not to be. Every year after that, on the anniversary of the night at Valentino's, Deborah and Enzo shared coffee at the community center, surrounded by families they'd helped, mothers who'd found jobs, kids who'd stayed in school, people who'd been given second chances they'd never thought possible. Lives they'd changed not through violence or money or power, but through choosing integrity when corruption would have been easier. Proof that one honest act can topple empires and redeem even the most broken souls. The Richard Mille watch sat in an FBI evidence room 3 floors below the Chicago field office, sealed in plastic and marked with case numbers that would outlive everyone involved in the investigation. A symbol of the night when a poor waitress showed a powerful man that some things, honor, dignity, truth, can't be bought at any price. And that sometimes, the smallest acts of courage can change everything. Thanks for watching till the very end. If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. I'll be dropping another unforgettable story tomorrow, so make sure you don't miss it.